My name is Elena. I was 33 years old the night my mother told 120 wedding guests that I was too selfish to help my own sister. The ballroom went quiet enough for me to hear the soft clink of a champagne glass against a serving tray. My younger sister, Vanessa, sat at the head table in a white dress that probably cost more than my first car. Beside her was her new husband, smiling awkwardly as my mother stood with a microphone in her hand. At first, I thought she was giving a normal wedding toast. I was wrong. "Before we celebrate this beautiful couple," Mom said, her voice carrying across the room, "I think everyone should appreciate how much Vanessa has overcome." People nodded politely. Then my mother turned toward me. And despite having a successful career, her own sister refused to help when she needed it most. A few heads swiveled in my direction. I felt my stomach drop. Mom continued. "Vanessa asked for support. She asked for family. Unfortunately, not everyone in this room understands what family means." The silence became uncomfortable. I sat frozen in my chair. Across the table, my father avoided eye contact. That told me everything. He knew this was coming. Vanessa lowered her eyes, pretending to look embarrassed. But I knew my sister. She wasn't embarrassed. She was enjoying every second of it. What none of them knew was that the story they were telling wasn't even close to the truth. The part nobody knew was sitting less than 10 feet away from me inside an old brown leather satchel resting beside my chair. A satchel I had carried with me for nearly 4 years. A satchel containing documents that would eventually explain everything. But that night, nobody bothered asking why I had made the choices I made. They preferred assumptions. Those were easier. My mother's voice sharpened. When Vanessa needed financial help, Elena said no. Several guests exchanged glances. Someone whispered. Someone else shook their head. The judgment was immediate. I had seen it before. People love simple stories. One sister good. One sister selfish. Case closed. What happened in the next few minutes changed everything. But at the time, I had no idea just how far this humiliation was about to go. Welcome back to Revenge Record family. If you've ever been underestimated by your own family, this story is for you. I wish I could say this was the first time my family had publicly embarrassed me. It wasn't. Not even close. For most of my life, I was the responsible daughter. The dependable one. The quiet one. The one who paid bills on time. The one who showed up early. The one who never created drama. Unfortunately, responsible people rarely become the favorite. They become useful. There's a difference. Growing up, Vanessa could do no wrong. If she forgot an assignment, it was because she was stressed. If she spent money recklessly, it was because she was passionate. If she made mistakes, people rushed to rescue her. When I succeeded, it was expected. When she succeeded, it was celebrated. I learned that lesson early. By the time we reached our 30s, nothing had changed. Only the numbers got bigger. Bigger requests. Bigger expectations. Bigger excuses. My mother raised her glass. "Family should help family," she announced. Several guests applauded. I stared down at my plate. Not because I was ashamed. Because I knew arguing would only make things worse. That was another lesson I had learned. People who have already decided you're guilty rarely listen to explanations. Especially in public. My cousin Rachel, sitting beside me, leaned closer. "Are you okay?" she whispered. I forced a smile. "I'll survive." But even as I said it, I felt every pair of eyes drifting toward me. Some curious. Some sympathetic. Others openly judgmental. Then came the comment that finally pushed things too far. My mother looked directly at me. "Some people care more about protecting their money than helping their own sister start a life." A few guests nodded. One woman actually clapped. I couldn't believe it. The irony was almost funny. Almost. Because the truth was that I had spent years helping my family. Years cleaning up problems nobody else wanted to handle. Years protecting information that could have destroyed relationships. Years carrying responsibilities that weren't mine. The leather satchel beside my chair suddenly felt heavier. At the time, I didn't understand how important that detail would become. Vanessa stood and wrapped an arm around Mom. "Let's not focus on negativity," she said sweetly. "The performance was flawless. If you didn't know her, you'd think she was trying to stop the criticism. I knew better. This had been planned. Every word, every look, every pause. The goal wasn't to discuss family. The goal was to make me look selfish in front of an audience. And judging by the room's reaction, it was working. My father finally spoke. "Let's just enjoy the evening." But he didn't defend me. He never did. Defending me would have required acknowledging facts. Facts made things complicated. Scapegoats made things simple. I glanced around the ballroom. Friends, relatives, coworkers, neighbors. More than 100 people. All hearing a version of the story that wasn't true. What my family didn't realize was that some lies only work until evidence appears. And evidence has a way of surviving longer than accusations. I rested my hand on the worn leather satchel. For a brief moment, I considered opening it right there, showing everyone, ending the entire charade. But I didn't. Not yet. Because the real surprise came later. And when it finally arrived, nobody in that ballroom would be prepared for it. Including me. The drive home from the wedding took nearly an hour. I spent most of it in silence. Not because I was hurt. At least not in the way people might think. The humiliation wasn't new. What bothered me was realizing that my mother had planned it. She hadn't made those comments impulsively. Every sentence had been prepared. Every pause had been intentional. She wanted an audience. And she got one. When I finally pulled into my driveway, I sat in my car for several minutes with the engine off. The leather satchel rested on the passenger seat. The same satchel I'd carried for years. The same satchel that contained answers my family didn't even know existed. I looked at it and shook my head. "Not yet," I whispered. Inside my house, I kicked off my shoes, poured myself a glass of water and tried to forget about the wedding. That lasted about 20 minutes. Then my phone started buzzing. First came texts from relatives, then friends, then people I barely knew. Some were supportive, others weren't. One message read, "Your mother seemed really hurt tonight." Another said, "Maybe you should have helped your sister." I laughed bitterly. Amazing how quickly people choose sides when they only hear half the story. The one thing they never bothered to ask was why I said no in the first place. Nobody ever asked that question. Because if they had, everything would have unraveled much sooner. Around midnight, my cousin Rachel called. "Can I come over?" she asked. "You don't have to." "I know." An hour later, she was sitting across from me in my kitchen. Rachel had always been different from the rest of the family. She listened before forming opinions. That alone made her rare. She wrapped both hands around a coffee mug. "That was awful." I shrugged. "It wasn't unexpected. It was planned." "I know." Rachel stared at me. "Why do you keep letting them do this?" I didn't answer immediately. Because the truth was complicated. The answer went back years. Long before Vanessa's wedding. Long before money became an issue. Long before my mother started turning family gatherings into public performances. The answer started when we were children. Growing up, our family looked normal from the outside. Dad worked in commercial construction. Mom stayed home for most of our early years. We lived in a nice neighborhood. We took vacations. We celebrated holidays. From a distance, everything seemed fine. But families can look healthy while something unhealthy grows underneath. In our house, that thing was favoritism. Vanessa was 4 years younger than me. She had blonde hair, a bright smile, and an effortless ability to charm people. Teachers loved her. Neighbors adored her. Relatives spoiled her. Meanwhile, I was quieter. More serious. More independent. I enjoyed reading. Planning. Organizing. I wasn't difficult. I simply wasn't exciting. When I brought home straight A's, my parents congratulated me. When Vanessa brought home A/B, they threw a celebration dinner. At first, I thought I was imagining it. Children often do. They convince themselves they're being treated unfairly. But eventually patterns become impossible to ignore. I remember one Christmas when I was 13. I had spent months saving allowance money for a bicycle. Months. I worked for it, planned for it, earned it. On Christmas morning, Vanessa got the exact same bike. The difference? She hadn't paid $1. My parents simply bought it for her. When I pointed out the unfairness, Mom laughed. "You're older." That was her favorite explanation. "You're older. You're more responsible. You're mature enough to understand." Those words followed me through my entire childhood. They sounded like compliments, but they were actually excuses. Excuses for expecting more from me. Excuses for giving more to Vanessa. Rachel nodded as I told her the story. That explains a lot. It gets worse. Because it did. As we got older, the favoritism evolved. When Vanessa wrecked her first car at 19, my parents paid for repairs. When I needed help covering graduate school expenses, they said I should learn financial independence. When Vanessa quit jobs unexpectedly, they supported her. When I worked 80-hour weeks building my career, they called me distant. No matter what happened, the rules were different. Vanessa received understanding. I received expectations. The gap widened every year. And yet I kept trying. I attended birthdays, holiday dinners, family reunions, graduations, baby showers, engagement parties. I convinced myself things would improve, that eventually my parents would see me, not as the dependable daughter, not as the problem solver, not as the backup plan, just as their daughter. I wish I could say that happened. It didn't. Rachel looked toward the leather satchel sitting on my dining room table. She had noticed it earlier. Everyone noticed it eventually. "You've carried that thing forever." I smiled faintly. "Pretty much." "You ever going to tell me what's inside?" I stared at the worn leather surface, at the scratches, the faded handle, the years of history it carried. Part of me wanted to answer. Part of me wasn't ready. One day, Rachel raised an eyebrow. "That's mysterious." "You have no idea." Because what sat inside that bag connected directly to everything my family believed about me. Everything they accused me of. Everything they thought they knew. And soon, whether I wanted it or not, those secrets were going to come into the open. The wedding wasn't the end of the story. It was only the beginning. And 3 days later, something happened that made staying silent impossible. 3 days after Vanessa's wedding, my phone rang while I was at work. I glanced at the screen. For a moment, I considered letting it go to voicemail. After everything that had happened at the wedding, I wasn't exactly eager to talk. Still, ignoring her would only create more drama. So I answered, "Hello." She didn't bother with a greeting. "You embarrassed us." I almost laughed. I was the one who had been publicly humiliated in front of 120 guests. Yet somehow I was the problem. "How exactly did I embarrass you?" "The way you sat there." I blinked. "The way I sat there?" "You looked angry." "Mom, you accused me in front of an entire ballroom. You could have handled it better." There was the familiar family rule. No matter what happened, my reaction was always more important than their behavior. I had spent years living under that rule. Years apologizing for things that weren't my fault. Years carrying responsibility that belonged to other people. And almost every time it somehow traced back to Vanessa. My sister had a talent for creating situations and then stepping aside while everyone else cleaned them up. She wasn't malicious. At least not intentionally. The real problem was that she'd spent her entire life believing someone would rescue her. As someone always had. Usually my parents. Sometimes me. Mom sighed dramatically into the phone. "Vanessa is upset. She's upset. She feels abandoned." I closed my eyes. Of course she did. Vanessa always managed to become the victim regardless of what actually happened. "Mom, I'm at work. We need to discuss your attitude." That sentence instantly transported me back 20 years. Because growing up, discussions about my attitude happened constantly. Usually after Vanessa made a mistake. Somehow her mistakes became my responsibilities. And if I refused to fix them, I was selfish. The pattern started when we were kids. But it became impossible to ignore once we reached adulthood. I ended the call as politely as possible and tried returning to work. Unfortunately, memories kept surfacing. Maybe because the wedding had forced me to see things clearly. Maybe because I was finally tired of pretending. Either way, I couldn't stop thinking about the history that had brought us here. The favoritism wasn't one giant event. It was thousands of tiny moments. Tiny moments repeated over years become a reality. One memory stood out more than most. I was 24. Vanessa was 20. I had just accepted my first management position at a financial consulting firm. The promotion came with longer hours and more responsibility. I was proud of it. Not because of the title. Because I'd earned it. No connections. No shortcuts. No favors. Just hard work. That same month, Vanessa decided she wanted to open an online boutique. At least that was the plan. The problem was she had no savings. No business plan. No experience. No inventory. No budget. Just enthusiasm. Mom and Dad immediately loved the idea. 4 weeks, family dinners revolved around Vanessa's future business. Her dreams. Her goals. Her potential. Then one night Dad turned to me. You should help your sister. I knew what that meant. How? Invest. There it was. I remember looking around the table. Everyone seemed to assume I would say yes. After all, I had a stable income. I had always been responsible. And responsible people apparently exist to fund everyone else's dreams. How much? I asked. Mom smiled. Only 10,000. Only 10,000. As if they were asking to borrow a lawnmower. I nearly choked on my drink. At the time, $10,000 represented years of savings. A safety net. Emergency money. The beginning of financial security. Vanessa leaned forward. I'll pay you back. I believed she meant it. The problem wasn't dishonesty. The problem was reality. She had no plan. No projections. No structure. Nothing. Just optimism. And optimism isn't a repayment strategy. So I said no. Politely. Respectfully. Firmly. The reaction was immediate. Mom looked disappointed. Dad looked irritated. Vanessa looked wounded. As though I had personally attacked her. I thought family helped family, Mom said. Funny how often those words appeared whenever someone wanted something from me. Not when I needed support. Only when I was expected to provide it. That wasn't the detail that mattered, though. The real issue came later. Because 6 months afterward, Vanessa's business collapsed. Exactly as I had predicted. Inventory problems. Shipping issues. Budget mistakes. Within a year it was gone. And somehow that became my fault too. According to my parents, if I had invested, the business might have succeeded. Never mind that I wasn't responsible for running it. Never mind that the numbers never made sense. Never mind that I had warned them. Reality didn't matter. The family narrative had already been written. Vanessa tried. Elena didn't help. End of story. Or at least that's what they believed. I wish I could say that was the worst part. It wasn't. Because the financial requests didn't stop there. Over the years they became larger. More frequent. More entitled. Every time I declined, another brick was added to the image they'd created of me. The selfish sister. The cold sister. The successful sister who forgot where she came from. None of it was true. But once people become attached to a story, facts rarely change their minds. Not immediately anyway. That evening after work I arrived home exhausted. The leather satchel sat exactly where I'd left it. On the dining room table. Waiting. I walked over and rested my hand on it. The worn leather felt familiar. Steady. Reliable. Unlike almost everything else in my life lately. Inside that satchel were records stretching back years. Documents, letters, statements, evidence, pieces of a puzzle nobody else even knew existed. Pieces that connected directly to my family's accusations, especially the ones surrounding money. I stared at the satchel for several seconds. Then my phone buzzed. A new message appeared. It was from Vanessa. Just 6 words. We need to talk. Tomorrow. At the time, I thought it was another argument. Another guilt trip. Another demand. I had no idea that conversation would lead to the first real crack in the story my family had spent years building. And once that crack appeared, everything else would start falling apart. The next morning, I met Vanessa at a small cafe halfway between our homes. She chose the location. That alone told me she wanted a serious conversation. Vanessa preferred comfortable places when she expected people to agree with her. Neutral places meant she wasn't sure how things would go. I arrived 10 minutes early. Old habit. By the time she walked in, carrying an oversized handbag and wearing designer sunglasses despite the cloudy weather, I had already ordered coffee. She sat down without smiling. "Thanks for coming." I nodded. "You said we needed to talk." For a few seconds she stared into her cup. Then she sighed. "I don't like what's happening between us." The statement sounded sincere. But experience had taught me to listen carefully. What exactly is happening? "You've been distant." There was not an apology. Not an acknowledgement of what happened at the wedding. Just another accusation wrapped in softer language. I took a sip of coffee. "Vanessa, Mom publicly called me selfish in front of 120 people." She shifted uncomfortably. I told her not to make a big deal about it. I almost laughed. That wasn't what I remembered. What I remembered was Vanessa standing beside our mother while guests stared at me like I was some heartless villain. But arguing over details wouldn't accomplish anything. So I let her continue. "I just wish you'd support me more." Support. Another family favorite word. In our house, support rarely meant emotional encouragement. It usually meant money, time, resources, solutions, things provided by me. I leaned back in my chair. "What exactly are you asking for?" Vanessa hesitated. That hesitation told me everything. A request was coming. Maybe several. Finally she spoke. "Daniel and I are trying to buy a house." There was. I waited. "And?" "We need help with the down payment." Of course they did. I stared at her. "How much?" She named the amount. I nearly dropped my coffee. $25,000. Just like that. As though she were asking me to cover dinner. Vanessa rushed to fill the silence. "It would only be temporary." I had heard those words before. Temporary. Short term. Just until things improve. Just until next month. Just until we get settled. Temporary has a funny way of becoming permanent. I looked out the window. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Vanessa quietly said something that caught me off guard. "You know, Mom and Dad think you owe us." I turned back toward her. "They think I owe you?" She nodded. "They think you've always had advantages." I stared at her in disbelief. Advantages. The word echoed in my mind. Every promotion I'd earned. Every late night. Every weekend spent working. Every sacrifice. Apparently those were advantages now. Not effort. Not discipline. Advantages. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes. Predictably, it went nowhere. When I finally stood to leave, Vanessa looked frustrated. "I don't understand why you're being like this." I almost responded. Almost. But there was no point. Because understanding required curiosity. And curiosity required asking questions. My family had spent years making assumptions instead. As I drove home, I found myself thinking about the leather satchel again. The satchel had become part of my daily life years earlier. Most people assumed it contained work documents. Some thought it was sentimental. A few relatives jokingly called it my security blanket. None of them knew the truth. The satchel wasn't important because of what it looked like. It was important because of what it protected. After arriving home, I carried it into my office. The room was quiet. Sunlight streamed through the window. For a moment I simply stood there. Then I placed the satchel on my desk and carefully opened it. Inside were dozens of organized folders. Each one labeled. Each one dated. Each one containing pieces of a story far larger than anyone realized. My fingers brushed across the worn edges. For years. That was how long I'd been carrying these records. 4 years of preserving documents everyone else ignored. 4 years of keeping information safe. 4 years of resisting the urge to expose everything. At the very top sat a cream-colored folder. Unlike the others, it showed signs of frequent use. I picked it up. The pages inside had been reviewed so many times that some corners were beginning to curl. As I flipped through them, memories surfaced. Phone calls. Meetings. Conversations. Warnings. Promises. The entire chain of events that eventually led to Vanessa's wedding humiliation. At the time, I didn't understand how valuable these records would become. I had simply believed someone needed to keep track of the truth. And in my family, nobody else seemed interested. The real surprise wasn't what the documents contained. The real surprise was who had originally asked me to protect them. That detail would matter later. A lot later. For now, I carefully returned the folder to the satchel. Then I froze. Something caught my attention. A voicemail notification. Unknown number. Received earlier that morning. I pressed play. The voice belonged to a man. Professional. Calm. Measured. Miss Harper, this is Robert Greene. We need to discuss the documents we reviewed several years ago. Please call me as soon as possible. My stomach tightened. Robert Greene. I hadn't spoken to him in almost 2 years. There was no reason for him to contact me. At least none that I could think of. The voicemail continued. Certain information has recently come to our attention. I believe you'll want to know about it. Then the message ended. I stared at my phone. Something felt wrong. Not dangerous, but significant. Like the first movement before an earthquake. I looked down at the satchel. At the folders. At the records that connected dozens of events across multiple years. Events my family knew nothing about. What my mother, father, and sister didn't realize was that some secrets become heavier over time. And eventually they stop allowing themselves to stay hidden. I picked up the phone. Then I called Robert back. That conversation would lead to the first major discovery. And once I learned the truth, there would be no going back. Robert answered on the second ring. Elena. His voice sounded exactly as I remembered. Calm. Professional. Careful. The kind of voice that never rushed into conclusions. It's been a while, I said. Too long. That wasn't an answer. Which meant something was wrong. I closed my office door and sat down behind my desk. You said there was information I should know about. A brief silence followed. Then Robert sighed. I recently received a request regarding records connected to your family's trust. My grip tightened around the phone. Family trust. Those 2 words immediately got my attention. Because very few people even knew it existed. And fewer still knew how complicated it actually was. What kind of request? Someone was trying to access documents. I frowned. Who? Another pause. I can't disclose everything yet. That answer irritated me. Robert knew I hated half-answers. He also knew he wouldn't have called unless the situation was serious. Then tell me what you can disclose. I can tell you the request wasn't routine. My stomach tightened. Meaning someone appears to be looking for information they were never told existed. I stared at the satchel sitting beside me. The room suddenly felt smaller. 4 years, those records had remained untouched. Ignored. Forgotten. Or at least I thought they had been. Now someone was digging. And I didn't know why. What exactly are they looking for? Robert's voice lowered slightly. That's the question. I leaned back in my chair. A memory surfaced instantly. 4 years earlier. A rainy Thursday afternoon. A conference room. A conversation I hadn't thought about in months. At the time, I had no idea how important it would become. The real story behind the satchel began that day. Not at the wedding. Not during Vanessa's latest request for money. Not even during childhood. Started with my grandfather. My father's father. Harold Harper. Most people remembered Grandpa Harold as quiet, practical, disciplined. He wasn't wealthy by billionaire standards. But he had built a successful regional construction company over 40 years. More importantly, he understood people, especially family. By the end of his life, he had watched enough family disputes to know what money could do. He knew it could bring people together. He also knew it could tear them apart. When his health began declining, he spent months organizing his affairs. Most relatives assumed everything would pass directly to my father. That seemed logical. Dad was his only son. Case closed. Or so everyone thought. The truth was much more complicated. A few weeks before Grandpa passed away, I received an unexpected phone call. He wanted to see me. Alone. I remember driving to his house after work, wondering why he hadn't invited Dad, or Vanessa, or anyone else. When I arrived, he was sitting on the back porch wrapped in a blanket. The autumn wind carried fallen leaves across the yard. He looked older than I remembered. Tired, but sharp. Very sharp. Sit down, Elena. I obeyed. For a while we talked about ordinary things. Work, life, the weather. Then his expression changed. I need you to do something for me. Those words would eventually change everything. What is it? He studied me carefully, as though measuring something, evaluating something. Finally he nodded. You're the only one I trust to handle it. At the time, I didn't fully understand what he meant. I wish I could say I asked better questions. I didn't, because I assumed there would be time later. There wasn't. A week afterward, Robert Greene contacted me. That was my first introduction to him. Back then, he served as one of Grandpa's attorneys. The meeting took place in a private office downtown. Only 3 people attended. Robert, another legal representative, and me. No parents. No siblings. No relatives. Just me. I still remember how strange that felt. Especially when they placed a thick stack of documents in front of me. Documents connected to Grandpa's estate planning. Trust records. Ownership records. Instructions. Letters. Pages and pages of information. Information nobody else in the family had seen. Robert's voice pulled me back to the present. Elena. Sorry. I was thinking. I figured. I looked down at the satchel. At the cream-colored folder resting near the top. The same folder I'd opened earlier. The same folder that contained copies of some of those original documents. What aren't you telling me? I asked. Robert hesitated. Not a good sign. Then he finally said it. The request appears connected to Vanessa. The room went completely silent. For several seconds I couldn't speak. Vanessa. That's my concern. I stood and walked toward the window. Outside, the neighborhood looked peaceful. Normal. The exact opposite of how I felt. How would Vanessa even know those records exist? I don't know. And what exactly is she looking for? That's what we're trying to determine. Trying. Not knowing. Neither answer made me feel better. Because one thing was becoming increasingly clear. This wasn't random. People don't suddenly start searching for legal documents they know nothing about. Someone had told her something. Or she had discovered something herself. Either possibility worried me. The leather satchel suddenly seemed heavier than ever. For years I'd carried it because of a promise. A responsibility. A trust placed in me by someone who believed I would protect the truth. Now that truth appeared to be moving toward the surface. Whether I wanted it to or not. Robert cleared his throat. There's one more thing. I immediately felt a knot form in my stomach. What? The inquiry was made 2 days before the wedding. I froze. 2 days before. Before my mother's speech. Before the public humiliation. Before Vanessa asked me for $25,000. Before everything. A terrible possibility entered my mind. One I wasn't ready to believe. Not yet. Because if I was right, the wedding wasn't just a wedding. It had been preparation. And if that was true, then my family was operating with information they thought I didn't have. The problem was they were wrong. Very wrong. And the first real discovery had finally begun. After ending the call with Robert, I sat alone in my office for nearly an hour. The same thought kept circling in my head. 2 days before the wedding. Vanessa had made inquiries about Grandpa Harold's trust records 2 days before standing beside Mom while I was publicly called selfish. That timing wasn't accidental. It couldn't be. The more I thought about it, the less sense it made. As far as I knew, Vanessa had never shown the slightest interest in Grandpa's estate. Not when he passed away. Not during the years that followed. Not during family gatherings when relatives occasionally discussed him. Nothing. And yet suddenly she was searching for information. Specific information. Protected information. Information that very few people even knew existed. I walked over to the leather satchel and pulled out the cream-colored folder. The one I always returned to when things stopped making sense. Inside were copies of letters, trust summaries, attorney notes, and handwritten instructions from Grandpa. I carefully spread several documents across my desk. Most people would have seen boring paperwork. I saw a timeline. A story. A record of choices. For years I had protected those records because I made a promise. Not because I wanted power. Not because I wanted leverage. Because Grandpa asked me to. And that mattered. A lot. I wish I could say I immediately found answers. I didn't. What I found instead were more questions. Questions that became impossible to ignore. The first one was simple. Who told Vanessa about the trust? The second was worse. Why no? At the time, I didn't understand how important those questions would become. The real answer was still hidden. But the clues were starting to line up. I called Robert back later that afternoon. This time he answered immediately. You found something? Not exactly, I said. I need context. Go ahead. I took a deep breath. Has anyone else contacted you? Pause. Then, yes. That got my attention. Who? I can't provide names yet. My frustration returned. Robert. I know. You're asking me to solve a puzzle while holding half the pieces. I understand. I rubbed my forehead. He wasn't being difficult. He was being careful. Lawyers live inside careful. Unfortunately, careful wasn't helping me. What can you tell me? Robert lowered his voice. I can tell you that more than one person has recently shown interest in the trust records. That was enough to make my stomach drop. More than one person. Meaning this wasn't a random curiosity. This was coordinated. Or at least connected. The wedding speech suddenly makes a lot more sense, I said quietly. What do you mean? I stared at the documents. A realization was beginning to form. Not a conclusion. Just a possibility. The speech wasn't really about money. Robert remained silent. Listening. Thinking. I continued. Mom wanted everyone focused on one narrative. What narrative? That I'm selfish. The words hung in the air. Because once I said them out loud, they sounded frighteningly logical. For years, my family had built a reputation around me. The successful daughter. The distant daughter. The one who never helped enough. The one who always said no. The selfish one. If something important emerged later, people would already know which side to believe. Or at least they would think they did. Robert didn't speak for several seconds. Finally he said, That's an interesting theory. Theory. Not proof. Not yet. But my instincts were rarely wrong. Especially when it came to family. I wish I could say that was the worst realization that week. It wasn't. Because later that evening I received an unexpected visitor. The sight of his truck pulling into my driveway surprised me. My father rarely visited unannounced. In fact, he almost never visited at all. I watched from the window as he walked toward the front door. Slowly, almost reluctantly. Something about his posture felt different. Uneasy. Nervous. That wasn't like him. When I opened the door, he forced a smile. "Can we talk?" I stepped aside. "Sure." A few minutes later we were sitting in the living room. The satchel remained visible on the dining table nearby. Dad's eyes drifted toward it almost immediately. Interesting. Very interesting. Because most people ignored it. Dad didn't. Not this time. "How have you been?" he asked. A strange question after the wedding. "I've had better weeks." He nodded. Neither of us mentioned Mom's speech. Not right away. The silence stretched. Then Dad finally sighed. "Your mother went too far." I almost laughed. That might have been the closest thing to an apology I'd ever heard from him. "She did." Another silence. Then he leaned forward. "Vanessa's under a lot of stress." There was the justification, the excuse, the familiar pattern. I wasn't surprised. What surprised me was what came next. Dad glanced toward the satchel again. Then he casually asked, "You still carrying that thing around?" My pulse quickened. I kept my expression neutral. "Sometimes." "Haven't gotten rid of it yet?" "No." His eyes narrowed slightly. Only for a moment. But I noticed. And suddenly a memory surfaced. Years ago, after Grandpa passed away, Dad had asked me a similar question. At the time I hadn't thought much about it. Now it felt different. Much different. The real surprise came later. But this was the first moment I genuinely began wondering whether Dad knew more than he had ever admitted. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes. Mostly small talk. Mostly avoidance. Then just before leaving, Dad stood near the door and said something that stopped me cold. "Some things are better left in the past, Elena." I stared at him. What does that mean? For a second something flashed across his face. Regret. Fear. Maybe both. Then it disappeared. Nothing. He opened the door, stepped outside, and left. I stood there long after his truck disappeared down the street. Those words echoed in my mind. Some things are better left in the past. Not because of what they said. Because of what they implied. Dad wasn't worried about old memories. He was worried about old information. Information connected to Grandpa. Information connected to the trust. Information connected to the satchel. And for the first time I realized something unsettling. Maybe Vanessa wasn't the one leading this search. Maybe she was only part of it. Maybe someone else had been pulling strings all along. And if I was right, I needed answers before the truth exploded in front of everyone. Because the confrontation I had spent years avoiding was no longer coming. It had already started. The morning after Dad's visit, I woke up with a feeling I hadn't experienced in years. Certainty. Not certainty about the entire situation. There were still too many missing pieces. But I was finally certain of one thing. The wedding humiliation had never been about helping Vanessa. It had been about positioning me, creating a story, establishing a narrative, making sure that when questions eventually surfaced, people would already know who the villain was supposed to be. Me. The selfish daughter. The ungrateful sister. The successful woman who refused to help family. The more I thought about it, the more obvious it became. And once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. I arrived at work early and spent most of the morning distracted. Around noon, Robert called. His voice sounded more serious than usual. "We need to meet." That immediately got my attention. "When?" "Today." My stomach tightened. "That sounds urgent." "It is." Those two words erased any remaining doubt. Something had changed. A few hours later, I walked into Robert's office carrying the leather satchel. The receptionist recognized me instantly. Apparently, some people never forget a woman who carries a mysterious satchel everywhere. Within minutes, Robert escorted me into a private conference room. The moment the door closed, I knew this wasn't a routine meeting. Several folders sat on the table. New folders. Not mine. Not Grandpa's originals. Recent files. Robert remained standing for a moment. Then he slid one folder toward me. Take a look. I opened it. Inside were copies of inquiry requests, contact records, communication logs, names, dates. My pulse quickened. The request stretched back nearly 6 weeks. Not 6 days. Not since the wedding. 6 weeks. Someone had been investigating Grandpa's records long before Vanessa walked down the aisle. What exactly am I looking at? I asked. Robert sat across from me. A pattern. I continued reading. Several requests had been denied. Others had triggered reviews. But one detail appeared repeatedly. The same name. Vanessa Harper. I wasn't surprised. Not anymore. What surprised me was the second name. My father. I looked up slowly. Robert nodded. You see it. He's involved. Yes. The room suddenly felt colder. Not because I hadn't suspected Dad. Because seeing proof felt different. Suspicion lives in possibility. Evidence lives in reality. And reality is harder to ignore. For several moments neither of us spoke. Then Robert carefully slid another document across the table. This arrived yesterday. I picked it up. The page contained details of a formal information request. The request had been rejected. But that wasn't the important part. The important part was what they had been trying to access. A specific section of Grandpa's trust. A section almost nobody knew existed. My stomach dropped. I immediately recognized the reference number. Because years earlier I had read every page connected to it. Every word. Every instruction. Every condition. At the time I hadn't realized how significant it would become. Now I understood. Someone was searching for exactly the same records Grandpa had personally asked me to protect. That wasn't coincidence. Not even close. I looked at Robert. What do they think they're going to find? His expression darkened. I think they already know something exists. How? That's what concerns me. The room fell silent again. Because that question changed everything. If Dad and Vanessa were searching for those records, someone had told them enough to start digging. Which meant information had leaked somewhere. The real surprise came later. But this was the moment I realized the situation was much larger than family drama. This wasn't about hurt feelings. It wasn't about wedding speeches. It wasn't even about money anymore. This was about evidence. And evidence makes people nervous. Especially people who have spent years believing a story that benefits them. I closed the folder. How long before this becomes public? Robert considered the question carefully. That depends. On what? On whether they continue pushing. I already knew the answer. They would. Because people rarely stop digging when they think treasure is buried nearby. The meeting lasted another hour. When it finally ended, Robert gave me one piece of advice. Prepare yourself. For what? His eyes settled briefly on the satchel. Then back to me. For the possibility that you'll need to tell the entire story. I left his office feeling exhausted, but strangely calm. For years I'd carried responsibility without knowing whether it would ever matter. Now it mattered. A lot. That evening, I returned home and spread the satchel's contents across my dining room table. Folder after folder. Document after document. Letters. Statements. Trust records. Notes. Instructions. Evidence. The complete history sat right in front of me. For the first time I reviewed everything as a single story. Not separate events. One story. One chain of decisions. One hidden truth. And suddenly I saw something I had missed before. A date. A very specific date. The significance hit me immediately. Because the date connected Grandpa's final instructions to an event that occurred years later. An event involving my father. An event nobody in the family had ever questioned. I stared at the document, then read it again and again. The connection was undeniable. At the time, I didn't understand why Grandpa had structured things the way he did. Now I was beginning to. He had anticipated something, planned for something, protected against something. And the more I understood, the more nervous I became. Because if I was interpreting the records correctly, the upcoming family reunion would change everything. The annual Harper Family Foundation dinner was scheduled for Saturday night. Nearly 20 relatives would attend. Aunts, uncles, cousins, family friends, people who had known each other for decades. Ordinarily, I would have skipped it. After the wedding, that would have been easy. But this year was different, because Robert had just informed me that several family members would be discussing Grandpa's legacy during the event. And for the first time, people might start asking questions. Real questions. Questions with documented answers. As I carefully returned the files to the leather satchel, I felt a strange mix of anxiety and relief. The truth had been hidden for years. Now it was moving closer to the surface. And whether my family was ready or not, the confrontation they had spent years avoiding was about to happen in front of witnesses. A lot of witnesses. Saturday evening arrived faster than I expected. The annual Harper Family Foundation dinner was being held in a private banquet room at a country club just outside the city. Nearly 20 people attended. Aunts, uncles, cousins, family friends, 2 longtime business associates who had worked with Grandpa Harold for decades. And most importantly, Robert Greene. The moment I learned he would be there, I understood this wasn't going to be an ordinary family dinner. Something was about to happen. I arrived carrying the leather satchel. As usual, a few relatives greeted me warmly. Others offered awkward smiles. Word of the wedding had spread. Family gossip always traveled faster than facts. Across the room, Mom and Vanessa stood talking with several relatives. The second they noticed me, the conversation stopped. That told me everything I needed to know. They were expecting something, or worried about something. Dad remained unusually quiet. In fact, he barely looked at me. That worried me more than hostility would have. Because guilty people often become quiet. The evening began normally enough. Dinner was served. People shared stories. Photos of Grandpa appeared on a projector screen. For a while, everything felt almost peaceful. Then Uncle Richard stood to speak. As the oldest member of Grandpa's generation still living, he traditionally delivered remarks about family history. Most years his speech lasted 10 minutes. This year was different. Halfway through he said something unexpected. One of Harold's greatest strengths was planning ahead. Several relatives nodded. Then he smiled. Sometimes a little too far ahead. Laughter filled the room. But Robert didn't laugh. Neither did I. Because we both knew what Uncle Richard didn't. Grandpa had planned much further ahead than anyone realized. The room settled. Then Uncle Richard added, "Of course, some of Harold's decisions remained private." That immediately got Vanessa's attention. I saw her sit up straighter. Dad too. "What decisions?" someone asked. Richard shrugged. "You'd have to ask Robert." Suddenly every eye in the room shifted toward the attorney. The atmosphere changed instantly. Curiosity replaced small talk. Robert calmly placed his glass on the table. "I wasn't planning to discuss legal matters tonight." Vanessa spoke before anyone else could. "Why not?" Too quickly. Too eagerly. The room noticed. I noticed. Robert noticed. He folded his hands. Because legal matters often create misunderstandings. Mom laughed nervously. "I'm sure we're all adults here." The irony nearly made me smile. Adults. Interesting choice of words. For years, assumptions had replaced facts in this family. Now facts were about to arrive. And facts are rarely polite. Vanessa glanced toward Robert. Then toward Dad. Then back again. The exchange lasted only a second. But it was enough. The connection was obvious. Robert saw it too. His expression tightened slightly. Then he said something that made the room fall silent. There appears to be growing interest in certain portions of Harold Harper's trust records. Nobody spoke. Not even Mom. The silence stretched. Finally Aunt Linda asked, "What kind of interest?" Robert carefully chose his words. "Recent inquiries." Vanessa immediately shifted in her seat. A small movement. But noticeable. Very noticeable. I wish I could say she remained calm. He didn't. People have a right to know what's in family records. The statement echoed through the room. Several relatives exchanged glances. Robert nodded slowly. Under certain circumstances, yes. Then he turned toward me. The room followed his gaze. 20 pairs of eyes suddenly landed on me. My pulse quickened. Not because I was afraid. Because I knew what came next. The moment I'd spent years trying to avoid. Robert spoke carefully. "Elena, would you mind bringing the satchel?" The room became perfectly still. Every conversation stopped. Every fork froze. Every eye followed me as I stood. I carried the leather satchel to the front of the room. The same satchel my family had ignored for years. The same satchel Grandpa had indirectly entrusted to me. The same satchel that contained evidence. Official evidence. Not opinions. Not accusations. Evidence. I placed it on the table. Then opened it. The sound of the clasp seemed louder than it should have. Inside sat the cream-colored folder. The one that mattered most. I handed it to Robert. Several relatives leaned forward. Mom looked confused. Vanessa looked nervous. Dad looked pale. Very pale. Robert opened the folder. Then removed a series of documents. Trust records. Signed instructions. Attorney certifications. Official filings. Every page verified. Every page authenticated. Every page legitimate. No room for argument. No room for interpretation. Just facts. Robert cleared his throat. Then addressed the room. Several years before his death, Harold Harper amended portions of his estate planning. Shock immediately spread across multiple faces. Mom frowned. What amendments? Robert lifted a document. The amendments were created because Harold became concerned about financial decision-making within the family. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The room had become completely silent. Then Robert delivered the sentence that changed everything. Harold specifically instructed that certain assets and ownership interests were not to be placed under the direct control of his son. That the color drained from my father's face. Gasps erupted around the room. Mom stared at him. Vanessa stared at him. Everyone stared at him. Because for the first time the family narrative was cracking. Fast. Robert continued. Instead, Harold assigned oversight responsibilities to Elena. The room exploded into whispers. Questions. Confusion. Disbelief. People looked from me to Dad and back again. The selfish daughter. The irresponsible family member. The woman publicly criticized at a wedding. Suddenly she was the person Grandpa trusted most. And that wasn't even the biggest revelation. Not yet. Because Robert wasn't finished. He lifted another document. A document signed by Grandpa himself. A document that would finally explain why my family had spent years attacking my character. And why they had recently become so desperate to access the records. The truth was finally out. And the room had gone completely silent. For several seconds after Robert revealed Grandpa's trust amendment, nobody spoke. The banquet room felt frozen. The usual sounds of a family gathering had disappeared completely. No conversations. No laughter. No clinking glasses. Just silence. The kind of silence that appears when people realize they've been missing an important piece of the story. Mom was the first to recover. "This doesn't make any sense." Her voice sounded smaller than usual. Less confident. Less certain. Robert calmly adjusted the document in front of him. "It makes perfect sense." "No," Mom insisted. Harold would never do that. Several relatives shifted uncomfortably. Because whether they agreed or disagreed, nobody could ignore the paperwork sitting on the table. Official records have a way of ending arguments before they begin, especially when they're properly documented. Robert remained composed. The documents were reviewed, signed, witnessed, notarized, and legally filed. There was no emotion in his voice. Just facts. And facts were becoming increasingly dangerous to the narrative my family had spent years creating. Vanessa looked from Robert to Dad. Then back again. What exactly are you saying? Her voice carried a nervous edge I had never heard before. Robert opened the second document. The room leaned in. Every person seemed to sense that something even bigger was coming. They were right. Because the trust amendment wasn't the hidden truth. It was only the doorway to it. Robert placed the document flat on the table. Then he began reading. Harold Harper stated that concerns regarding financial judgment, repeated personal debt issues, and long-term asset protection required independent oversight. The room went still again. Several relatives slowly turned toward Dad. Others toward Vanessa. Nobody said anything. But the implications were obvious. Very obvious. The image Grandpa had carefully documented was dramatically different from the image my family had spent years presenting. The successful provider. The responsible decision-maker. The trusted son. Those assumptions were beginning to collapse. Then Robert continued. To ensure family assets remained protected, oversight authority was assigned to Elena Harper. Aunt Linda gasped softly. Across the room, Uncle Richard closed his eyes and shook his head. Not in disbelief. In understanding. As though pieces were finally falling into place. I wish I could say I felt victorious. I didn't. Mostly I felt tired. Because carrying the truth for years isn't satisfying. It's exhausting. Especially when people spend those years accusing you of things that aren't true. Vanessa finally looked at me. Actually looked at me. For the first time all evening. What does oversight authority mean? Robert answered before I could. It means Elena was responsible for monitoring and protecting specific family assets according to Harold's instructions. The room erupted into whispers. Questions spread from table to table. People began comparing memories. Old conversations. Past events. Suddenly details that once seemed unimportant started making sense. And that's what happens when truth enters a room. It reorganizes old memories. The real surprise came next. Because Robert lifted one final document. The document Grandpa had personally written. His letter. The letter that had remained inside the leather satchel for years. The room became silent again. Then Robert read aloud. If Elena is reading this, it means I made the right decision. The words hit me harder than I expected. I hadn't heard them spoken aloud in years. She understands responsibility better than anyone else in this family. Several relatives immediately looked at me. Others looked away. Embarrassed. Uncomfortable. Because many of them had believed the wedding story. Many had believed the selfish sister narrative. And now Grandpa's own words were challenging it. Robert continued. Being trusted is not a reward. It is a burden. My throat tightened. I remembered reading that sentence for the first time. I remembered realizing how much responsibility Grandpa had placed on me. Responsibility I never asked for. Responsibility I never talked about. Responsibility I protected anyway. Then came the sentence that changed the room completely. If anyone ever questions Elena's decisions, they should first ask themselves why she was given authority that others were not. Silence. Absolute silence. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Nobody needed an explanation. The meaning was obvious. Grandpa had answered the question years before anyone thought to ask it. Why Elena? Because he trusted her. The answer had been sitting in the satchel all along. Mom looked devastated. Not angry. Not defensive. Just stunned. As though she suddenly realized how many assumptions she had made. How many conclusions she had accepted without evidence. Vanessa's reaction was different. She looked confused, lost. For years she had believed a version of events that placed her at the center of every story. Now she was discovering there had been an entirely different story running underneath, one she never knew existed. Then Dad spoke. Finally. His voice sounded older than I remembered. I never told them. The room turned toward him. Nobody interrupted. Nobody rushed to his defense. Nobody knew what was coming. Dad lowered his eyes. I knew about the amendment. Gasps erupted throughout the room. Mom stared at him. Vanessa looked horrified. Even relatives who suspected something seemed shocked. Has this changed everything? Dad knew. All these years. He knew. The room remained silent as he continued. I wasn't told every detail. But I knew enough. Mom's face went pale. You knew. Dad nodded slowly. I knew my father had concerns. The words sounded painful. Heavy. Like a confession he'd been carrying for years. I thought it was unfair. Nobody responded. What could they say? The documents already existed. The decisions had already been made. The evidence had already spoken. Arguments were pointless now. For years, my family had built a story around my refusal to help. Now they were discovering that many of those decisions weren't selfish at all. They were responsibilities. Responsibilities connected to promises. To legal obligations. To Grandpa's instructions. The narrative was collapsing piece by piece. And nobody could stop it. Because the truth remained undeniable. Not because I said so. Not because Robert said so. Because the documents existed. The records existed. The evidence existed. And once evidence enters the room, excuses become much harder to maintain. The family wasn't screaming. Nobody was throwing accusations. There was no dramatic explosion. Just something far more powerful. Reality. And reality was finally catching up to years of assumptions. The collapse wasn't happening through anger. It was happening through understanding. And for the first time in my life, people were beginning to see me clearly. After Robert finished reading Grandpa's letter, nobody rushed to leave. In fact, most people stayed exactly where they were. The atmosphere in the room had changed completely. Not because there had been a dramatic confrontation. Not because anyone had been publicly destroyed. Because something much rarer had happened. The truth had finally caught up with the story. For years my family had viewed me through a lens they created themselves. The responsible daughter. The difficult daughter. The selfish daughter. The successful daughter who supposedly forgot where she came from. Now they were being forced to reevaluate everything. And that process wasn't comfortable. Especially for the people who had contributed to the misunderstanding. The silence lingered until Mom finally spoke. Elena. I looked at her. For once she didn't sound defensive. Or angry. Or disappointed. She sounded tired. I didn't know. The words hung in the air. Part of me wanted to respond immediately. Another part wasn't sure what to say. Because technically she was telling the truth. She didn't know. But she also never asked. And those are two very different things. I know, I said quietly. Mom lowered her eyes. I should have. That simple sentence carried more weight than any apology she had ever given me. Not because it fixed the past. Nothing could do that. But because it acknowledged something important. The assumptions. The favoritism. The years of choosing one version of events without looking for evidence. Across the room, Vanessa remained unusually quiet. Eventually she stood and walked toward me. Several relatives watched nervously. Maybe expecting another argument. Another confrontation. Another family scene. Instead, Vanessa stopped a few feet away. I didn't know either. I nodded. I figured. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she asked the question I had waited years to hear. Why didn't you tell us? It was a fair question. One I had asked myself many times. The answer wasn't complicated. Because Grandpa asked me not to. The room grew quiet again. I continued. He trusted me to follow his instructions, whether people agreed with them or not. Vanessa looked down. For the first time all evening, I saw genuine regret in her expression. Not embarrassment. Not frustration. Regret. And that mattered. Because regret creates room for growth. Defensiveness doesn't. The wedding. She began. Then stopped. I waited. She took a deep breath. The wedding wasn't fair. No dramatic speech. No tears. Just honesty. And honestly, that was enough. I wasn't looking for revenge. I never had been. What I wanted was simple. I wanted the truth to exist in the same room as the accusations. Now it did. And the truth had spoken for itself. The real surprise came later. Over the following weeks. Because once people learned the full story, many relationships began changing. Not overnight. Not magically. Real life doesn't work that way. But gradually, cousins who had quietly judged me started reaching out. Relatives who had believed the wedding narrative apologized. Some apologized directly. Others did it through actions. Both mattered. Even Dad changed. Not dramatically. He wasn't suddenly a different person. But for the first time in my adult life, he started having actual conversations with me. Honest conversations. The kind we probably should have had years earlier. One afternoon, several months after the family dinner, he came to my house. The same house where he'd once looked nervously at the leather satchel. The satchel sat on the dining table between us. As usual, Dad stared at it for a moment. Then he laughed softly. I used to hate that thing. I smiled. I noticed. He nodded. I think it reminded me of my father. That answer surprised me. But it also explained a lot. Because sometimes people aren't angry about objects. They're angry about what those objects represent. The satchel represented responsibility, trust, accountability, things Grandpa valued deeply. Dad looked at the worn leather and sighed. He was right about one thing. What's that? Trust is a burden. I couldn't argue with that. Because it was true. The satchel had never been a source of power. It had been a source of responsibility. A responsibility I carried for years while being misunderstood by the people closest to me. Eventually, I made a decision. The records didn't need to travel everywhere anymore. The truth was no longer hidden. The evidence no longer needed protection. So I purchased a fireproof archive box and carefully stored the original documents. The satchel itself remained on a shelf in my office. Not because I needed it, because it reminded me of a promise I kept. And sometimes that's worth remembering. About a year after the wedding, Vanessa invited me to dinner. Just the two of us. No parents. No audience. No speeches. No expectations. The conversation wasn't perfect. Neither were we. But it was real. And that felt like progress. As for Mom, our relationship improved too. Slowly. Carefully. With effort from both sides. Trust takes years to damage. It also takes years to rebuild. The important thing was that rebuilding had finally begun. Looking back now, I realized something I couldn't see at the wedding. The public humiliation wasn't the end of my story. It was the end of a false story. The story that said my worth depended on other people's opinions. The story that said being misunderstood meant being wrong. The story that said I needed approval from people who never bothered to understand me. I don't believe those things anymore. And if there's one lesson I've learned through all of this, it's this. You do not need permission to know your worth. Some people will misunderstand you no matter how hard you try. Some people will judge you before asking questions. Some people will believe the loudest version of the story instead of the most accurate one. Let them. Because the truth has a remarkable quality. It doesn't require constant defense. It doesn't require performance. And it doesn't require revenge. Eventually, if it's protected long enough, the truth speaks for itself. And when it does, the room goes silent.